Yeah. Amber, it's not a race. Everyone, you were psychic last time. It's totally fine. So if everyone would please list their name and organization in the chat, that would be great. All right, so we have had, this is what, I think my 5th session of the day, and I have been so dazzled by everyone's focus and willingness to participate in a very sort of balanced way, in that folks are advocating for their positions while still being respectful of other people's positions. I just adore all of you. I'm so excited with the way today went. And now we're going to take sort of in some ways one of the most difficult topics of our day, which is what do we do in the event of a fatality or other tragedy? So what do we currently do? And how can we do it better? And what would you, as stakeholders, like to see CDHS in particular, the office, the OEC, God, it's late. I'm going to say a bunch of nouns wrong in the next hour. Just prepare yourself. My brain is just a little fatigued. The OEC do differently or do it all. So I don't know. I will try. So if I don't know where to start, it might make the most sense to start with someone volunteering to provide sort of a brief summary of what the fatality review process looks like now. Sort of start with the more clinical and then maybe go beyond that to some of the more feelings driven or atmospheric kind of concerns. Can someone talk to us about sort of what happens when there's a fatality now?
This is Kate Jankowski from the State Health Department, and I'm happy to share a little bit about what I know our partners at the Child Fatality Review Team as part of the Administrative Review Division at CDHS do, but I don't see anyone else. I know Lucinda serves on that team with me, so I'm happy to share.
That would be great. And then Lucinda and anyone else can jump in with the role that they play or other perspectives that they have.
Okay, great. So we're fortunate in Colorado to have 2 complementary child fatality review processes that really function sort of as one system. So the Child Fatality Review Team, or CFRT, at Human Services, it's run out of the Administrative Review Division under Allison Gonzalez's and Mark Mackert's leadership. And that review process reviews deaths of children in Colorado whose families or themselves had history with child welfare within the prior 3 years. In partnership with our colleagues at CFRT at the State Health Department, we also have a process called the Child Fatality Prevention System. This is a public health child death review process, and so we review all deaths of children that occur in Colorado, ages 0 through 17. And that ends up being around 600 to 700 deaths every year. And 2/3 of those deaths are due largely to perinatal conditions or congenital malformations and happen really close to the time of birth. The remaining roughly 1/3 are due largely to undetermined causes or injury and violence. So that could include child abuse, suicide, motor vehicle fatalities, drowning, overdose deaths, and of course includes child maltreatment deaths.
Just to interrupt you, so you've got the administrative review team for the child fatality review team that focuses on deaths where there was involvement in the last 3 years. What was the second one called?
The Child Fatality Prevention System.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Very, very similar names, which is definitely confusing. But we serve on each other's teams, and we are required by statute to make joint prevention recommendations every year.
Okay.
So the public health process that I'm fortunate to work with, we review all deaths, not those deaths with history with child welfare. So any child that dies in Colorado, 0 through 17, receives a review as part of our system. And then We take the deaths that are due to undetermined causes, injury, or violence to an advanced review, and those teams are coordinated largely by local public health departments, but they include partners from different community stakeholders like human services, community members, law enforcement, schools, anyone who might have knowledge of the child or their family.
Okay, great.
Lucinda's definitely been participating on both teams, and I don't see anyone else on. So I don't know if I missed anything, Lucinda, that you would like to add.
No, I think you covered it really, really well. I added into the chat that the CFRT only reviews those that, as you said, are only had some child welfare involvement in the last 3 years, and there was a substantiated finding for abuse and neglect in the fatality itself.
Got it. What, if any, communication comes out of those meetings to the general public? Understanding that these are sensitive things for families, so.
Yeah, so both systems are charged in statute with providing annual legislative reports.
Okay.
I don't want to speak out of turn about the Child Fatality Review Team out of Human Services report, but I can tell you that the public health report includes a summary of some of the trends and patterns that we're seeing in child deaths in our state, as well as prevention recommendations or recommendations to decision makers, policymakers, on things that we can do as a state to prevent child deaths from happening in the future.
Is that something that someone could pull up on the interwebs and we could throw into the chat? If not, if that takes time, or if it's, we can always do it for the next meeting.
Very easy to share, but my only hesitation is that our next reports are due on July 1st to the legislature, and so we'll have our updated information available in days. Perfect. And so I would prefer to share the updated information if that's okay with everyone else.
That makes all the sense. Maybe if I forget, you or someone from, you or Lucinda or Nicole or someone from could put that in the chat in July. We'll make sure to, on our July 1st meeting or at the subsequent meeting if it's not online quite yet.
Absolutely.
So the Child Fatality Review also does an annual report, which is also due on the 1st of July. And once it's approved, it too is a public document, and it reviews things a year. There's a year lag. So it is a review for 2020, right? Or am I 2019? I feel like it's 2019.
I think that it includes information from 2020, right? Because we're reviewing them as part of CFRT right now.
Yeah, sorry, my timelines get a little crazy there. And so that is a public document, and it does have the recommendations that are shared recommendations with the CDPHE, Child Fatality Prevention System. So it has that included in it. It also has some county specific and some systemic recommendations that are outside of that shared recommendation. And those are based on very specific cases and what the cases, the lessons learned has brought back to us. In addition to that, if things go through a child fatality review and once it is cleared by the district attorney, then additional information is posted on our website. That information is redacted to a certain degree. So it doesn't include all of the confidential information, but any child fatality in Colorado that's reviewed by CFRT is posted on a website with some of that information redacted.
What was the name? The county or CDPHE Child Fatality. What was the full name of that title?
Child Fatality Prevention System. And I'm happy to share. We have a website with our current data set, and I'll just drop that in here, and I can find CFRTs as well. We have an interactive data dashboard where you can look at child fatality data by county.
Great.
So that information is updated. Unlike CFRT, our most recent data is 2019. It's typical for public health review processes to review deaths more retrospective. So our partners at the local level are just now reviewing deaths from 2020.
And so Are you under different agencies? Or are you both under, is one of the agencies that are CFRT, they're under CDPHE, and the other one's under CDHS?
So CFRT is under CDHS. And so it is through our Administrative Review Division, which is a division in CDHS.
Mhm.
And it includes collaboration with the Division of Child Welfare. And then the other one, the Child Prevention, is CDPHE.
Got it.
And Laura, I would just offer that cases that don't meet criteria, perhaps to go to CFRT. So maybe did not have history in prior 3 years or were not substantiated. I know my county has critical incident review internally that will include sometimes coroner, law enforcement, other entities. And I know that there's many other county departments that have those also, those internal review processes.
Mhm.
And to Nicole's point, also anyone that does go through CFRT, those also have an internal review process at the county level.
Mhm. I wonder if, as we consider the different ways that we might involve law enforcement in identifying care that is of concern, that is unsafe, if there are any lessons learned from the interdisciplinary work that you all have done that we might incorporate into that work.
I think the two things that I know have come up consistently in our county, and this also may, outside of childcare facilities, that could also be very relevant to foster homes or group center homes too, that we also investigate. But I think one of them is awareness, which this group and the subgroups are touching on. So education of parents seeking childcare, of individuals regarding, licensing requirements, and also education for first responders, law enforcement, caseworkers that are out there and maybe coming across these situations. That's been a theme that we've for sure identified in our county.
Excellent. One thing I want to be mindful of is that there is a difference between, that education alone still does not prevent all tragedies, right? You can have a person who is educated and has gone down and asked the right questions and still have a tragic outcome. So as we think about, in particularly this subgroup, when we're talking about what we should do or how we respond when there is a tragedy, I want to, and this isn't something necessarily you need to answer right now. Again, I welcome follow-up, but I want to make sure that the language that we're using is in the prevention sphere, does not somehow in a backhanded way, victim blame families that have experienced a tragedy. So, and I don't know how to thread that needle. I'm not savvy enough, but to the extent that you all have thoughts, and again, these are things you can share in this, a Zoom meeting or in a future meeting, or shoot me an email. Sometimes it's not possible to come up with the perfect language, but I think we can strive to come up with the best possible, because I do think, I like the words awareness and education, because those are words that are, are impactful and important and relatable for folks. And I just want to make sure that we use them in a way that is supportive. And does anyone have any thoughts on how best to thread that needle?
I can kick us off. Thanks for bringing that up. I think that's really essential to our child death review processes in Colorado, and just in the acknowledgement that these deaths are really a community responsibility and require all sorts of different partners with different expertise, including, folks representing families and community members to be involved. And that so I think that's really something that I think about a lot too, right? Is that we don't want to say that these deaths are the result of something caregivers did or did not do, that we know that there are environments that are more or less supportive of families. And so I think childcare is such a good example. And Of course, we want families to have all the information to make the best choice for them. But if childcare is unaffordable or inaccessible in so many communities in Colorado, that doesn't really have anything to do with individual caregivers and parents and families. And so I think that's part of the frame that we take in our joint work with Human Services as part of child fatality review, and why we make recommendations that are to policymakers, because we really believe that families are doing their very best to make their families thrive, and that our decision makers, people that control state budgets, really have a role in that prevention too.
Thank you, Kate. I like your point about budgets too, and I'll say something I said in the last meeting. The state funding plan is up and awaiting comment. So if you have comments, find them, make it. I think it's a good process to go through to make sure that the funds that are available to the department and to the state in general are used in the way that creates the greatest impact, because that's obviously what we all want. And if your direct folks who are receiving your direct services or your constituents are unable to access that for language or computer access or whatever reasons, to the extent you can speak out on their behalf, that's always it feels good. All right, here's a comment in the chat. My biggest concern is that after the death of a child, the illegal providers continue to offer care with ratios of 15+ kids. I don't know if that comment's talking about licensed care or non-exempt care that requires a license but doesn't have one. But I have received some separate emails too about the importance of ratios, and maybe we should reduce ratios. I'm not sure that that's within the scope of this particular Zoom call, but I do think it's important to think about numbers, and whether it's the 4 children of more than one family, whether it's that number or whether it's the question of ratios. Important things to think about.
Well, and when we're talking about the systems that then do a look back or a lessons learned or a systemic review of fatalities that occur in a childcare setting, I think we need to have a little bit of distinction between an unlicensed situation where there was a fatality versus a licensed center, because when we're looking at it through our formal systems, not as much through CDPHE, but through child welfare, we would look at those two things differently.
And Lucinda, when you talk about unlicensed, are you talking about unlicensed in general or unlicensed and not exempt?
Unlicensed and not exempt.
Okay. Help me understand how we look at those things differently.
So if it were a licensed facility and a fatality occurred, child welfare, the county, would investigate that as though it was an institutional fatality. So they would look at it through a really prescribed process. If it were an unlicensed, non-exempt family, that may be looked at as an intrafamilial fatality, depending on how the relationship was with that kid, or maybe not. They may not look at it at all, because it may end up going to law enforcement and go outside of the scope of child welfare.
Got it. This may be too precise for the purposes of this conversation, but do you have any insight or vision into how that determination is made as to whether it's an intrafamilial fatality or not looked at at all and it goes to law enforcement?
It would really be based on the relationship of the caregiver and the child, and what if the parents were there, were they not there? Was it a child that was being taken care of by another child? So it might be that would be an intrafamilial, because the parent didn't provide the appropriate supervision for the child at that time. And so it's kind of a nuanced sort of situation, and it's a gathering of a lot of information to determine where that would lie. If a child is staying with grandma and grandpa and they're caregiving, and it may be a child care situation because grandma and grandpa are caring for all of their grandchildren, that would probably be an intrafamilial in most counties. However, if it was somebody down the street who has 3 or 4 different families, kids in the home, that would probably not be an interfamilial, and it's not licensed, so it probably would be turned over to law enforcement.
Got it.
And we have 64 different counties, and although we like to pretend that all 64 of them follow rules the way we intend them to, they do not. And by no fault of their own, there's an interpretation. They may have had the benefit of having a lot of interventions from child welfare or from our institutional assessment team, or they may have not had any. And so that also is really dependent on what's going to happen next. Who is the person that they talked to when the fatality occurred?
Yes. For those of you who work in these review positions, is there information that you wish this group had that this one does have, or are there other sort of holes or opportunities for additional, and whether it's sort of systemic information or information about a particular case? And you can just ponder that too if it's not something you do. I'm looking for sort of communication avenues, both between organizations and then in a particular circumstance with the different people who fill different roles within within a particular investigation or response.
Laura, I know that licensing doesn't always get informed when there's an infant fatality in an unlicensed care situation.
Mhm.
I think it's, really dependent, like Lucinda's point of that counties are different, law enforcement, if they haven't had involvement before, I think it really depends on whether we're notified when they see that care is going on, is dependent like on how knowledgeable they are about what's required and, um, uh, you know, to involve us.
Mhm.
So, and a lot of times we actually get involved because the child protection workers have spoken with law enforcement and said, there's a care situation here. Have you notified licensing? So sometimes it's actually the county child protection workers that will tell law enforcement we should notify licensing because there's care going on.
Mhm. And I see
Well,
Lucinda's comment that sometimes, oh, I was just gonna, go ahead.
yeah, and so it's not only is child welfare not always involved in those situations, so that we may not even know. So if a child is taken from an emergency into an emergency room, so hospital staff may not know to call. And again, it depends on the hospital and it depends on the county, especially if the caregiver is the one that brought them in.
Mhm.
So child welfare may not know if law enforcement was involved or law enforcement is doing an on-scene investigation and the parents aren't there. Depending on the law enforcement agency, child welfare may or may not be informed at that moment and early on, especially if it's a situation where it's an unlicensed caregiver, and they don't know the difference between exempt or not exempt. They don't know, or licensed or unlicensed even. I mean, a law enforcement walks in and there's a fatality and they have to do an assessment on scene. They don't know the details of our systems, right? They don't know them at all. And they may or may not call child welfare. We would probably find out about it down the line, but maybe not in the moment.
So I think these are good points in light of our conversation earlier about the kind of information that law enforcement needs, and then just in other communications questions. I wonder if this is not something also, Adam, maybe to include in that kind of just really basic training of, making the email or the call to say, I went in here and here was my concern. We could do something similar for a fatality or injury. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Again, I know Douglas County, we're pretty strict. We notify Human Services about everything. I mean, anytime there is a kid involved, no matter if it's a non-criminal and incident report that's taken, our policy actually dictates that our guys have to write up at the top forward a copy of this to Human Services. And then when it comes through to either records, if it gets sent back to patrol or if it gets forwarded to investigations, I look at it and then I pull it and forward it to Human Services. So we're pretty good about, we notify them about everything.
Mhm.
You know, sometimes if it's not an emergency type situation, it could be 1 to 3 days, depending on if the report is taken on a Friday or on a Monday. But in the event of fatality or abuse resulting in any type of SBI or injury, we will call DHS and get them involved on the spot. Our patrol guys are pretty good about either calling or notifying someone in the SVU unit to get direction, and will call. We got a pretty good working relationship with everybody over there, and we'll just call the workers directly and tell them, hey, this is what we got going on. So
That's helpful. Is there something about the way that you do things which promotes communication that we could suggest to other departments that don't have that immediate gut instinct?
You know, I don't know, because I know a lot of other agencies don't have a great relationship with their human services. We are very lucky. Again, I have not worked with any other human services, you know, from any other counties, but I'm going to go out there and I'm going to kudos Nicole over here. I think we got the best. Our caseworkers are.
I love it. I love it.
They're awesome. They're, you know, we all know each other pretty well, and everyone's really open with one another. They pretty much in day-to-day constant contact with our investigators in SVU, because that's who typically is in dealing with these type of cases. But I don't know. I think one of the big things is it's probably more on the law enforcement side of an issue than a DHS side of an issue, because law enforcement, we're often very, we don't need your help. We can handle it. You know what I mean? We'll take care of this. And so I think a lot of communication dies down on our end because we just want to handle it.
Right.
So, but we've done a very good job on our end of instilling it in our guys that, hey, we got to work with them. They need to work with us, and, you know, putting a lot of things in place to enhance our communication and flow of information between the two agencies. So
I was
don't know
just
if
going
that
to
answers your
add,
question.
yeah, I was just going to add to Adam. You know, a lot of it has to do with, I think, relationships, and when both agencies can see the value that we both contribute. And not all of our jurisdictions or other jurisdictions do share that. The one thing that we've really been trying to work in Douglas on is that every child death is notified to us. It's really hard, I think, sometimes for the coroner and for law enforcement if it isn't immediately abuse or neglect related, or if it seems like it may be accidental. But we really are kind of trying to impress upon the fact that we may have information about that child or family. We may actually even have custody of that kid for some reason, or, you know, have a need to know. And so the sheriff's department does an amazing job of just notifying us. If it doesn't turn out being something that requires a joint effort, we're still there to support them and provide information that might benefit whatever information they're learning. But it is not consistent across the state as far as child deaths being notified to the right people. And I would say licensing is oftentimes that, like, well, how do you get a hold of them? Who do you call? What's the process? You know, and if you don't have relationships with that group, you may not know how to in emergency get a hold of them, or why they would maybe need to know, even if it was a SUA death or something that wasn't immediately, you know, we've had a lot that came in looking like one thing and really turned out over time to be something very different. So I would just offer that that is something that's a challenge, I think, statewide. I've reached out to a lot of the Metro Child Protection. Lucinda and I have had this conversation 1,000 times just about child death notification and who that should be, what that should be. So I would just offer that, but the sheriff's department does a great job.
Is that, well, good job. I love it when people work together, and I appreciate that you both seem to see each other's strengths. I think that's amazing. Is there a group or a way for to agree on a statewide system, or is that naive to think that there would be a statewide system because different folks have such different resources and experiences and everything else?
Hey, Laura, I think what we had talked about in, what was it, 2 sessions ago?
Yeah, earlier
Talking
today.
about, yeah, talking about having a hotline email or something like that.
Yeah.
They could be pushed out to everybody so that, I don't know if that same type of thought can be handled, or, to this type of incident, but
Mhm.
we need to be able to shoot an email to a general that goes out to several different people. So if one
Yeah.
person's not available, someone always gets it, and they at least, we can shoot an email to and say, hey, we've had a child fatality. This is where it's at. We're at this hospital or whatever. Here's my contact info, or here's the road supervisor who's handling it. And then that way someone from licensing or whoever, needs it, can get a hold of somebody on scene in real time while they're still handling it, to be able to at least assess whether or not they need to send somebody out right away, or if it's something that, hey, we have to wait for these certain things to happen and then we'll get involved.
Okay.
Right. So Laura, I'm wondering also if there's a statewide system for child death notifications beyond the systems that we already have, which is what I'm kind of hearing you saying. I don't know if there's anybody on this call from any of the hospitals. So the hospitals are really where most of those notifications, or a large portion of those notifications, come from, because child fatality often happens after the incident occurs and the child is then under medical care.
Yeah.
So including them in that, here, the challenge with that is they too are not the same kind of system. They're all independent hospitals working in their own way in different places. And so I know that we struggle with getting any kind of consistency in reporting from our hospitals overall. And with child fatality, I think that would be another hurdle we'd have to figure out how to do. And how do you notify? And, I think one of the challenges with a childcare placement, or whether they're in childcare, licensed, unlicensed, irrelevant, when the child has a fatality, or there's a fatality, not because of anything anyone did, but because the child had a medical emergency. They had an asthma attack that they didn't know the child had asthma, and ends up passing away because of that. So all of those kinds of things, and the spectrum of why children die is pretty broad. It isn't always because somebody did something or was negligent, or because they were unsupervised, or because they because they died with intent. So the spectrum is very, very broad. And we know that most kids who die don't die because somebody intended for them to. It's usually a very tragic accident, and one bad decision.
Would
Laura,
something,
can I ask a question? Oh,
I wish you would. Go ahead.
well, it was just making me think about whether this group intends to, or was intended that this group is limited to just fatality. And in CFRT with this Department of Human Services, we review near fatality, egregious, and fatal incidents of child abuse. And I think it's really kind of enriched the conversation over time. Lucinda, don't you think, as far as looking at prevention opportunities truly before there is the absolute fatality? Didn't know if there was room for the consideration of that.
Absolutely.
We've had,
yeah,
there's been a lot of cases, and I think law enforcement and human services sees this more frequently, that there's an injury, maybe presents itself before or after childcare, and then it's a joint investigation on the institution and the parents, and those are very, very, very challenging. From the get-go, they're very difficult for us to determine who, if anyone, caused the injury or the egregious incident.
How would, if we expanded, and I didn't intend to limit, although I probably did just with my language, to just fatalities, but if we expand the incidents that we're examining here from fatalities to including near fatalities and other other incidents, how would that inform or change anything we've talked about so far? And maybe it wouldn't, because we've only been talking for half an hour, but in general.
I think those are challenging They're challenging to investigate. I think we learn each time we get one. They do seem to come in clusters, but they're challenging to investigate and they're challenging to conclude with any sort of kind of concrete recommendations. And I also think, there's a benefit to other people, other systems seeing how, the investigation progressed and being able to say maybe, in the future, this is like a better way. And it also, I think it leaves a lot of coordination with our medical professionals because they don't always present in a really clear way. And so there's a different medical intervention, I think, at that kind of emergency room visit and even at children's that we really struggle with. If we lose it and don't really kind of get ourselves together from the beginning, we end up never knowing really what happened to that child. And we don't really know how to secure safety in either the facility or in the family home sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think there's a cross-system coordination to review those. And
I like that. That's helpful. Thank you for that perspective. Lucinda, did you have a follow-up?
I did. I think so. One of the challenges that we've had through our child fatality review in looking at egregious is just getting really clear definitions on what's egregious and what does that look like. And if that's going to be pushed down and have in childcare settings, I think being really clear and concrete on what is egregious in this environment and what is not. I mean, just because it's a really bad injury or it may have long-term effects doesn't necessarily mean that it's egregious.
Mm-hmm.
And so being really clear on where that is and what those lines look like.
Speaking of my lawyer heart, I love a good definition. So it makes me so fun at parties. That's not true. That's not true. It doesn't make me fun. I like that. I like that point because I hadn't thought about that, about how to define that.
Mm-hmm. And we can certainly share the definitions that we use for child fatality. And though we
great, Lucinda, if you would.
And even though we think they're pretty clear, and again, Nicole involved in this one, of course, we've had some times where there is a difference of opinion on is this egregious or is it not? And I won't give you the gory details of what involved, but we still struggle with that and have regular conversations over what makes it egregious as opposed to being severe, or which doesn't make some of those things less horrible, by the way.
Right.
But is it really the appropriate thing to look at with an egregious near fatality and fatality lens or not?
Okay.
Hey, Lucinda, I mean, I think you almost need to, when you're talking about defining egregious, you almost need to break it down into two separate categories, right? You need to break down the actual injury itself, whether the injury is what level it is egregious, not, and you need to separate that, take that away and look at specifically the act or the lack of acts that cause that injury, because I think you can have an egregious injury without having an egregious act that caused that. You know what I mean? Me being, who I am, any injury to a kid is egregious, but I'm a softie. So, but it might not be an egregious, act that led to that injury. So I think you almost need to break it into two separate categories to really be able to get a good rounded understanding of kind of how to proceed.
I think that's great. Just a couple things from the chat. In Douglas County, when you all work together, or maybe in your other jurisdictions, Nicole or other folks, do you all use the sudden unexplained infant death investigation form?
So
No, sorry. Who was talking? No, we don't use it as sheriff's office.
Okay.
I mean, we have a couple of those forms as kind of, guides while we're working through an investigation for things to keep our eyes on and stuff, but we don't actually use that form in our investigation.
So the reason I ask is it's from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and it's been around a while, but we know that it's not widely used in Colorado, but it's such a comprehensive form. And to Adam's point, really guides you through some of the detailed questions you'd want to ask the caregiver or the parents or whoever was with the infant when they were found deceased, to really help you figure out, is this child maltreatment? Is this a sleep-related infant death? It's very comprehensive. And so One of the things we're working on as a system is developing an online training for this form because it is admittedly pretty long. And so we're hoping to have that available in the fall. But our hope is really that law enforcement agencies and coroners offices really do use this form. And I'm happy to share it in the chat, but I was just curious. Thanks for answering.
Thank you.
That would be
That's
amazing.
helpful. I wonder, I mean, I'm thinking about how several of you have expressed concern or personal frustration or anecdotes about folks not communicating, about not sharing information in that sort of instantaneous way. And I'm wondering if, we had talked about, providing email notifications from law enforcement to licensing if there's a concern about unsafe care. I mean, are we leading up to some sort of, I don't mean structure for structure's sake, but are we leading towards some sort of ombudsman who's providing details on all of these, or does that already exist? Sorry, that's my husky. He would really like to go for a walk. Please ignore him. He's not being abused in any way. So, I mean, how do we, all right, knock it off. I'm going to text a kid. Is there, how do we hold people accountable and decrease the amount of misses? Is it education of individual groups, or is it, centralization of things?
Are we talking misses in communication between law enforcement and other agencies, or are we talking, what are we talking?
Well, I think we've identified law enforcement and other agencies sort of going both ways, right? That law enforcement isn't being notified, and then vice versa, that law enforcement isn't notifying, licensing and child welfare. And then we also, I think it was Lucinda who identified, but I could be wrong, the issue with hospitals not necessarily looping folks in. So I don't know if we have some sort of central repository database, something where folks are communicating, or is it just a matter of reminding everyone that they need to communicate? Or how do we change that behavior? More of a carrot in that we are able to function better, or is it more of a stick that you're somehow, I don't know.
I mean, at least from my standpoint, I think just reiterating, I think the information's already out there from the standpoint of, mandatory reporting and things like that. The hospitals down here are pretty good about letting us know about stuff. I mean, I don't know, you could talk with the school district and see what they're doing, because their teachers are terrified not to report anything and everything. So yeah. I don't know what kind of whips they're using on the teachers, but whatever type of stuff they're doing might be good to push out to everybody, if it's an issue, across the state regarding hospitals and things like that.
I mean,
I think it's a matter of the when, not the ever, right?
Okay,
so,
that's good.
So I don't think and I think across systems, it's become, in the past 5 years, it has grown and become more effective by a lot, by really a lot. So I think hospitals really struggle when there is, and again, I work in a system where it's egregious, near fatal, and fatality. So I could be lumping all that together. That when it's hospitals, if there's a fatality and it's a child who passed away and it's a medical reason why they passed away, there's no need for them to contact child welfare for that, right? There's a medical reason why this child died. And if there is a reason, they will eventually get to us, because they all have social workers, except for the really small hospitals.
Okay.
And sometimes they over-report. I mean, so it's kind of this mixed bag of them. And law enforcement, depending on the law enforcement of when they inform. And sometimes it waits until it gets all the way up to somebody's doing a review of paperwork, and they go, hold it, you didn't call DHS on here? You probably should have called DHS. And so there's an after the fact report that comes. And that's with, usually some of the metro ones are pretty good about that. The mid-sized ones are a little bit different, but we have some jurisdictions that have 12 different law enforcement agencies and 12 different ways of how they report up and what that looks like, and confusion over who they call and when. So I think part of it is a systems issue, is us being more clear on who you call when and where, and what number do you pick up the phone and call. I mean, Adam is very fortunate that he lives in Douglas and knows the people in Douglas. So if you don't have a direct line, you have a direct name of somebody you can contact.
Right.
I don't think that's the case across the state.
So is the tool, since we're focusing on sort of tools that would be useful to overcome issues, maybe like a standard response protocol that folks can then customize for their location? So it's, then they populate it with names and say, you know, here's a best practices, and then you need to custom, with the understanding that you need to customize it with details from your location. If you don't have, you know, a social worker on site, you know, all of a sudden you have to do it in a reasonable time frame or something like that, where it's more like, here's a policy that you all can customize.
Maybe. And so I would be more inclined to actually pull some hard data on that before sending out a wide tool that said this
Okay.
needs to be fixed, because I think I think it's very specific and very dependent on a lot of different things. It's more nuanced than just creating a tool and a process.
Great. And where would we need to grab that data from, or who would the stakeholders be in that? And you can think about it. You don't have to tell them right now.
I probably need to think about it.
That would be great.
I have a question too. It strikes me that the system that's in place for public health to receive death notifications of all children seems like a fairly streamlined system. And I frequently get ready to go to our tri-county review, and I get a list of names and ask for records. And there still are many occasions that we maybe weren't notified or weren't even aware. Maybe it was a suicide. And that's another, I think, kind of difficult one for us right now, is not being notified of youth suicides. But I also can see why maybe law enforcement doesn't. But I don't know if there's a system that you guys already have in place that seems to work for at least the notification piece, if there's a role that engaging other folks somehow, I don't know.
So,
Well, I'd just like to say, and kind of licensing is the last to be notified, right? So I think that's the piece we don't want to miss as well, is like, even, and I will say, you know, it's like, to Lucinda's point, it is so much better in the last few years, even when, because if child protection gets notified, most of the time licensing will get notified if there's any care going on. And we do get notified from law enforcement directly sometimes, but typically it really is the child protection worker. So if child protection is not notified, then a lot of times licensing won't be notified. So I just kind of want to put a plug out there for us, if we're trying to really coordinate the system, that, you know, licensing is kind of the last piece that gets notified.
Can oh, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to say quickly to Nicole's comment that, you know, our public health child death review process relies on vital records data. So if a death certificate is generated in Colorado, we have an agreement with our vital records partners at the state health department, and that's how we assign cases. And so that works well, you know, once the death certificate has gone through the process, but not so much before then, and definitely not obviously for an egregious fatality or an egregious incident where there wasn't a death.
That's good to know.
So it seems like a lot of the issues, or the main issues surrounding being able to contact people and being notified, is just communication, knowing who to call, you know, who's available, you know, at this time or whatnot. You know, one of the things that, you know, granted, we're not a small agency, but we're not a huge agency either. I think we've got 500 deputies or so sworn in Douglas County. But I have a list like above my desk of the phone number and name for every single person in DHS, every caseworker. I've got everybody's number right there. And then once a month, I get sent from DHS, they send me an email that has that month's on call, after hours, the case, whoever is on call for that week with their phone number. So for example, the other night, patrol was out on, I think it was either a child abuse that was with injury or interfamilial sex assault on a child. So one of those two. Anyway, they were trying to reach out to the on-call, the after hours on-call line, but it was busy because they were busy handling something else. Well, I could see how that they waited for like 10 minutes or so to get somebody. No one answered because the line was busy, right? I could totally see how in another agency or whatnot, just getting frustrated and saying, well, the hell with it, we'll just notify them later, right? But then what happens? You get busy doing stuff and you forget to notify people, right? And then stuff falls through the cracks. But the on-call supervisor called me directly and said, hey, we can't get a hold of anybody. You know, we're just on hold. Can you help us out? Well, I have the email with, and I know exactly who's on call. So I have their numbers. So I just called her directly and said, hey, they're trying to get a hold of you. Can you call dispatch and get put through to this supervisor on the road? And that was it, right? And that was a complete fix. But the only reason we're able to do that is because we got really good communication with patrol, investigations, and human services, all working together. And I know that's a lot, again, more so probably on the law enforcement side, to get detectives and supervisors, supervisors to buy into being available to take a phone call and reach out to somebody to help patrol or whoever out. But I think if you can get people to have just the better communication, I think it'll solve a gigantic piece of the issue we're talking about right now.
So is that communication a series of calls from, law enforcement to Child Protective Services and then to licensing, a series of calls, or are we talking about a central repository of that data where there's one place anyone who has information notifies?
That's a tough question. I think with as far as licensing and stuff like that, it probably would have to be a centralized kind of local thing, because I don't think Douglas, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know if Douglas County has a specific group that just does licensing for Douglas County, or my understanding is licensing is for the entire state, right? But again, correct me if I'm wrong. So as far as licensing stuff, I would think you'd probably need a centralized, hub to send that information to. But for everything else, it's quicker just to go on the local level and me work with Douglas County and Jeffco work with them, and Adams and vice versa, or else I think you'll still get that information that's lost.
Mm-hmm.
And we do, so licensing does assign licensing specialists per geographic area. So you do have licensing specialists that work in Douglas County, and usually that's how they have those good relationships with the child protection workers there. And so it's pretty coordinated mostly across the state, but we do have a complaint line for licensing that's manned during business hours, but also available 24/7 that we check, so we do have a complaint line which we have been notified through law enforcement before. I would say child protection workers, usually our specialists have a pretty good working relationship with them. So usually they have other avenues to speak to each other, but normally when we're notified by law enforcement, it is through that complaint line a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
So Laura,
Our
I'm wondering if the
main
issue, sorry, Karen.
That's okay.
So Laura, I'm wondering if the issue that we need to solve is not what's happening at the local levels, because that's a local level problem to resolve if there is one. But what we're really looking for is a way for at the state level to when we get information to make sure that the right people at the state level have that information. So it sounds to me that Karen and licensing don't have a place to get or keep that information. And it's kind of getting sporadic, hit or miss. Is that right, Karen?
Yes, that's correct. It really depends. I mean, we're notified, and if we're notified, we'll follow up. And sometimes, it just depends on our relationship a lot of times with those particular counties or municipalities and how well they know to notify licensing.
So that the information up is where the problem is at the statewide level. So not at local level, like Adam and Nicole have displayed very beautifully how their system works at that local level and what that can be. And at the state level, it seems like we have some work to do to make sure that that is, from a statewide perspective, that is more consistent.
And so, yes, I think that makes sense. So then on a state level, are we looking to all of these different folks to report up to the state? I mean, do we have just even a hotline so that there's a phone number or a central email repository? You could have duplicate details then, but that's a fine problem to have, right? If you hear both from DHS and from law enforcement and a hospital or something.
So if local law enforcement and DHS, so that's their information. So when DHS hears about them, they provide them to we have a statewide repository that Nicole and every other county reports those to, and that is stored. If there is a way to take when that information comes in and it is something to do with a care provider that is not a parent, that is then shared with licensing, that feels like that might be a place to stop the gap.
What is that statewide repository called, Lucinda?
So that is the Child Fatality Review Team System, and it's an email address, a CDHS address.
And so we could expand, is that only fatalities or is it near fatalities and egregious?
It's egregious, near fatalities and fatalities, and they don't have to have been investigated yet. So many things that come into that, I don't man that, a different group looks at that and they say, oh, no, this doesn't quite meet the criteria for egregious. So it was sent there, but it's essentially put on the back burner. So they keep the information, they just don't do anything with it. So we get a lot of those that come in on a regular basis. And then if there is again, these are child welfare specific. So if there is an allegation that the fatality, near fatality, or egregious may have been caused by abuse or neglect, then those then go through another internal system. So we have a separate internal system that occurs. Then there's another system that counties then do to follow up to do their investigation and assessments. And if it's founded, then they do yet another step. And then it comes to child fatality review if it meets all of the criteria. So there's many different layers of filtering that down. And one of those layers can then include, and it could be the first one, is if this child was in the care of someone not their parent and in a not 24-hour care facility, then we would also notify licensing. I think our current system can be tweaked to create that.
Tweaked to do that. And then I think the question is, what, if any, data can we gather or should we gather about what's happening on a local level to make sure that we're supporting folks on a local level to make that statewide repository as robust as it can be or as it can be? And then what would the community at large like licensing to do in the event of a serious incident in a care facility? Is it just proceed through these existing channels, or should there be a separate review by licensing of something? We're at time, so we don't have to answer that. We could meet again, but
yeah, let me scope that out. I might need to draw myself a map.
fair enough. I like maps. I'm a big visual. All right, well, thank you everyone for really digging in this late in the day to all of those issues. I think what we've identified are some strategic partners who could maybe be activated to participate in a slightly different way or be more consistent. And then an existing mechanism that we may be able to tweak in order to make it more robust and useful to everyone. And then I think some important data will be coming up that maybe we can take a look at after July 1 to see if there's anything else we can learn from those incidents, and then to go to the next level. What else did I miss? Anything? Well, regardless, it's 5:30. So thank you all so much for yet another hour of your time. I really appreciate it. Have a great night. I'll talk to you all soon.